1972, Uruguayan Flight 571 was flying from Uruguay to Chile for a rugby game. On board were 45 people. There was 5 pilots and crew. The other 40 were the rugby team and their friends and relatives. So they take off and they're making their way to Chile, and the pilot was relatively inexperienced and he made a fatal mistake. He believed it was time to make their descent into Chile, but he was actually about 70 kilometers early. So as he's descending through the clouds, he believes he's going to see a runway and land this plane. Instead, he sees the Andes Mountains, and it's too late to pull up out of the way. He basically nicked the mountain, causing the plane to start tumbling down at breakneck speeds, 350 kilometers per hour. As it's tumbling down the mountain, the tail breaks off and 7 people are sucked out immediately that all perish. It's blazing down this mountain, and then it comes to a crashing stop where on impact it kills the 2 pilots. But miraculously, of the 45 people on board, 33 were still alive when all the dust settled. But that night, 5 more people would perish from the freezing temperatures, and within a couple days of this crash landing, another person would die. Those who were still alive that weren't in a coma or critically injured used luggage and debris from the plane and seats to create shelter, and they actually started pulling out lipstick from inside of some of the passengers' luggage, and they tried to write SOS on the outside of the plane because the fuselage was still pretty clearly intact, but they didn't have enough lipstick. They didn't have any medical supplies, and they didn't have proper clothing for the temperatures they were in. They did not anticipate being in minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures for extended periods of time. They also had very, very little food, and it was running out very quickly. In a very cruel twist of fate, they actually found a working radio that allowed them to tune in and listen to the media as they tried to find them. And so they had to listen in horror after about a week when the search was called off, because no one knew where they were, and the assumption was they must have all died in the crash. When the food finally ran out, survivors began eating the seats inside the plane, the leather and the cotton. But as they're doing this, they know what the next step has to be if they're going to survive. They need to eat the dead. And so on day 9 of the ordeal, the survivors ate the pilots. And they chose the pilots because they were the only people amongst the dead that they didn't personally know. The rest of the dead that they would ultimately eat were their friends and loved ones. Now, naturally, these people did not want to become cannibals, but virtually everyone, out of a need to survive, was able to make the adjustment. There were some people that couldn't, including one woman who didn't eat and ultimately died of starvation on day 60 because she just was not prepared to do what was necessary to survive. As if this situation wasn't bad enough, an avalanche would eventually strike the landing site, killing 8 more of these people that are doing everything they can to survive. But at the time of the avalanche, their food source had effectively run out, and so those 8 people who perished in the avalanche ultimately replenished their food source. From day 1, the survivors discussed climbing up and over the mountains and walking towards Chile to try to search for help. But the attempts so far had all failed due to extreme cold, malnutrition, altitude sickness. It was like they knew as soon as they walked over that mountain, they were going to die. And so many of them decided early on that they would rather just stay with the group, because at least that way they would die as a group, or maybe by some stroke of luck they could still be discovered and they might be easier to discover as a big group. But 2 months after the crash, and with no help in sight, they know the search has been called off. 2 of the survivors basically say, screw it. I'm gonna make the trek over the Andes Mountains. We have no supplies, we have nothing, no map, no compass, no anything. We're just gonna walk roughly in the direction of Chile, and you know what? We're either gonna die here or we're gonna die out there. And so the 2 take off. They somehow survived for 9 days, walking over the Andes Mountains with no equipment. They've been out for 60 plus days at this point, and they managed to walk into this valley, and they see that there are people living in this valley. There's actually a couple of fishermen right on the other side of this river. And so they go down to the edge of the river and they're yelling out to these people on the other side. The fishermen couldn't make out what they were saying. And so the fishermen, they got a piece of paper and they put a pencil in it and balled it up with a rock and threw it across the river. And they were able to write down that they had survived a plane crash. They were located back in that direction. There was 14 other survivors and they desperately needed help. Balled it up, threw it back. 3 Chilean helicopters were spun up and sent off in their direction, and the 14 other survivors were able to be picked up, brought to safety, and all 16 would make a full physical recovery. However, the most difficult thing they would ever have to recover from was becoming reluctant cannibals, which is something that haunts all of them to this day. And here is the famous final picture of inside Uruguayan Flight 571 just moments before they crashed into the Andes Mountain and had to go through that horrific 72-day ordeal. At around 8 p.m. on August 19th, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raimundo Marfa da Silva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raimundo lived in this shack with his father Rivelino, as well as his 2 younger brothers, who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room, only a few feet away. Raimundo and his family were very, very poor. I mean, the shack was very small. It was only composed of 2 rooms, the main room he was in right now, and also the kitchen, which was connected by a single door. And they were truly like out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money. I mean, they really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raimundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, there wasn't really much else to do here, his father, Rivelino, came into the room from the kitchen and he sat down next to him. And the two just sat there quietly, periodically poking at the fire with a stick and just sitting there enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the 2 younger brothers. And as these 2 were sitting there, suddenly Raimundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. And so he turned his attention and he looked into the dark kitchen and he saw this dark figure on all 4s quickly kind of maneuvering across the ground out of sight. And immediately Raimundo's terrified. He has no idea what this is. And so instinctively he turns to his dad, and his dad is also staring at the kitchen, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. And then before Raimundo could do anything, his dad jumped up and slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. And at that point, the 2 younger brothers, they've woken up, and all 4 of them are looking at each other like, what's going on? And Raimundo, he says to his dad, what was that? Now, it was clear that Rivelino was very unsettled by whatever this was. I mean, they didn't have pets. There was no other people inside of their shack. Like, there shouldn't be anything alive inside of the shack beyond them. So he doesn't know what it is. He's scared, but he tells his boys, it's okay. It's all right. I don't know what that is, but let's just stay here, we're safe. The door is locked, we're all here, we're safe. And so the boys, they all just kind of trusted their dad, and everybody just kind of hunkered down together and just sat there quietly, kind of waiting to see if they would hear anything else. And for a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Rivelino and his sons began to hear voices, and they were coming from outside the shack. And at first, they couldn't really tell what these voices were saying. They were kind of garbled. But eventually, they all began to hear the same thing. Whoever was out there, or whatever was out there, was talking about Rivelino. Specifically, they could hear that name. And what they were kind of saying is, if Rivelino comes out here, we're going to kill him. And the moment that all the boys sort of picked up the fact that somebody's out there and they're threatening to harm Rivelino, they're all like, Dad, what do we do? What do we do? And Rivelino, I mean, he's hearing this too, but he tells his boys, it's okay. I don't know what's going on out there, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This is a prank. This can't be real. And so Rivelino told his sons, their plan is they're just gonna stay put. They're in this room, they're safe, the door is locked. We are gonna wait until the sun comes up, and then we'll figure out who did this, who's playing this prank on us. And so sure enough, Rivelino and his sons would stay in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m. when the sun began to come up again. And at that point, Rivelino told his sons to stay put, and he was gonna go out there and investigate. And by this point, they had stopped hearing voices. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. It sort of felt like whatever that was, whoever that was, had passed. And so, the tension is gone, and the boys are like, okay, be careful out there, Dad. And so Rivelino, he walks over to the door that leads into the kitchen. He unlocks it, opens it up, and Raimundo, he's craning his neck, looking into the kitchen, but, he can't see anything moving around in there, even with the light coming in. And so Rivelino, he says, okay, boys, stay here. And then Rivelino goes out into the kitchen and shuts the door behind him. And while he's out there, Raimundo and his brothers, they're all listening anxiously, making sure their dad's not in trouble, but they just hear the sound of their dad just clearly walking around the kitchen. There's no commotion, there's nothing. And then a couple of minutes later, Rivelino comes back into the main room where the boys are, and he's got a knife in hand, but he tells them, it's okay, I got this from the kitchen, I'm just in case. There's nothing out here. I'm now going to go outside and just make sure nobody's outside the hut, okay? So again, stay put. I'll be right back. And so again, the boys, they're looking at their dad like, okay, we'll see you soon. Rivelino walked out again into the kitchen. He shut the door behind him, and then the boys heard the sound of the door that led outside open up. And then, presumably, Rivellino went outside. And that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from Raimundo's family's shack. And at some point, they came across this huge boulder. And this boulder had a big crevice in it, like a big gap in this rock. And one of the hunters happened to walk past it and looked into this crevice, and they found a skeleton. And that skeleton belonged to Rivellino, Raimundo's father. But that was not the end of the story, far from it. So on the day that Rivellino stepped out the front door and then was never heard from again, Raimundo and his brothers had been instructed by their dad to stay put while Rivellino went out looking around. But Raimundo just felt really nervous after his dad had stepped out the front door and had presumably stepped outside. So he defied his father, he opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and as soon as he did, he looked towards the door that led outside, and he saw it was wide open. And he saw his dad stepping into this huge cloud of yellow smoke. And amidst this smoke were these cylindrical objects that were floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, seemingly spitting out this smoke. And Raimundo, he had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad just kind of walking into this cloud, and then the smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad. His dad was gone. And so Raimundo yelled out for his dad, like, "Dad, where are you going?" And he charged towards his father to try to stop him. He just felt like, you can't go out there. But as soon as Raimundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated, the cylinders disappeared, and as soon as it was all gone, his dad was gone too. Raimundo sprinted around his house, calling out for his dad, looking everywhere, but there was no sign of him. And so quickly, Raimundo and his brothers alerted authorities, and they launched this search for him, and for days they combed the area near that boulder as well, and they couldn't find Rivellino. And so eventually, they abandoned the search, and then 6 months later, his body was magically found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Rivellino and how he wound up inside of that rock crevice. Also, people have no idea what that dark figure was skittering across their kitchen floor the night before Rivellino went missing, or who those voices were threatening to kill Rivellino, or the objects that Raimundo apparently saw floating in the sky spitting out yellow smoke. Nobody has any idea what any of that stuff is. All we know is Rivellino disappeared and 6 months later turned up dead in that crevice. A young woman named Karen parked her car just outside of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This famous museum is home to over 15,000 pieces of priceless art from ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, Asia, the Islamic world, and 19th century France and America. The outside of this 4-story building is strikingly plain, but inside is strikingly gorgeous. There is this lush green open-air courtyard that sits right in the middle of the museum that all of the galleries look down into. Karen was an art enthusiast, and she was a security guard at this museum, and that day she was on duty. After parking her car, she got out and walked her way over to the employee entrance, and there she pressed the buzzer and announced her arrival to the 2 night shift guards that she would be relieving. But after a few seconds, the night shift guards did not respond to her, and they did not unlock the door. And so after a little while, Karen pressed the buzzer again and said, "I'm here, can you please open the door?" But again, the guards that were on duty did not respond back to her, and the door did not open. This was highly unusual, so Karen left the door, found a payphone, and called the chief of security for the museum, who lived out in town, and told him she couldn't get in the building. And so about 10 minutes later, the chief of security shows up, and he takes Karen, and he walks her around to the other side of the building. He leads her up an outdoor flight of stairs to another entrance to the museum. He pulls out a big ring of keys, he finds the right one, and he opens the door. The entrance they were going through placed them in this dark hallway that stretched out straight in front of them, and then at the very end of the hallway on the right was this very brightly lit room that the door was wide open to, and that was the security office where the guards were supposed to be. And so Karen and the chief, they begin walking down this hallway expecting to get to the end of it and look inside this room and see these guards and get an explanation for why they didn't buzz Karen in the first place. But when they reach the end of the hallway and they look in this office, there's nobody inside of there. And now that they were up close, they could see the door leading into the security office had been smashed open. In fact, the doorknob to this door had been smashed off and was laying on the ground. And then next to it, right in front of them, was this metal crowbar. And then above them, the one camera that would have seen whatever had happened in the hallway, it had been turned around and was facing the wall. So Karen and the chief, they know they've stumbled on something that's probably really bad. They don't know what it is. They don't know if there's still people inside the museum. They don't know where the guards are. So the chief just grabs the crowbar for protection, and he and Karen run into the office and they call police. Although they didn't know it yet, Karen and the chief had just discovered one of the most famous crimes in history. The night before, 23-year-old security guard Rick Abath trudged his way down the walkway towards the employee entrance of the museum. He and another young man named Randy were scheduled to work the overnight shift that night. Rick hated his job at the museum because it was incredibly boring, but Rick didn't really have many other employment opportunities to choose from. He was a guy that had dropped out of music school and spent most of his time smoking marijuana, drinking beer, and playing in his friend's rock band. And so he just kept this job that he hated. Once Rick got inside the museum, he walked over to the office where he found his partner that night, Randy, was already sitting behind the desk. After chatting with him for a few minutes, Rick said he would do the first set of security rounds, and so he grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight and he headed out to the exhibit halls. Almost immediately, a fire alarm went off. Rick went to the area where it was going off and he investigated and did not see a fire, and so he just turned the alarm off. The building was very old and it wasn't uncommon for their electronics to fail or glitch. And so after this, Rick didn't think much of it. He continued doing his security rounds, and after about 30 more minutes of that, he made his way back down to the security office where he traded places with Randy. Rick took the seat behind the desk and Randy took the walkie-talkie and flashlight and headed out into the exhibits. About 30 minutes later, while Randy was still doing his security rounds, Rick had his head down on the desk when he heard the sound of the buzzer coming from one of the outside doors. He lifted his head up and he looked at the screen that was connected to the camera looking down at whoever was outside at this door, and he saw there were two police officers standing right outside the door. And so he reached over and he pressed the intercom button and he said, "Hey, can I help you?" And the officers said they were there responding to a disturbance call. Can they come inside? Now, Rick didn't know what this was about. He assumed it must have to do with maybe the fire alarm that had gone off earlier, or maybe somebody outside had seen someone trying to break in and they had called it in. But either way, he felt like it was important enough that he should let them in, even though it was against protocol to allow anyone into the museum after hours, including police. And so the two officers, they come through the doors and they wind up in the hallway right outside of the security office, and there's a window into the security office so both the officers and Rick can see each other. And the officers immediately say to Rick, "Hey, are you working alone tonight?" And Rick says, "No, my partner is out doing security rounds. He'll be back soon." And so the officers just kind of nod their heads and they're looking around the room for a second. And one of them, as he glances at Rick again, he does kind of a double take and he goes, "Wait a minute. I think I know you. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You need to come out here and show me your ID." And so Rick is caught completely off guard, but he just kind of instinctively does what he's told because it's a police officer. And so Rick stands up, he walks out of the office, he goes out into the hallway, and as he's about to present his ID to the inquiring officer, the officer just grabs him, pushes him up against the wall, and handcuffs him. And so before Rick can say anything, Randy, his partner, comes back from doing his security rounds. He walks into the hall and has no idea what's going on. The other officer, the one that had not handcuffed Rick, grabs Randy and does the same thing, presses him up against the wall and handcuffs him. And so as Randy and Rick are standing there up against the wall with their hands behind their back, they're looking at each other, they're looking around thinking, what's going on here? And at some point, Randy just blurts out, "Why are we being arrested?" And that's when one of the officers just says, "Oh, you're not being arrested. You're being robbed." Rick and Randy were led by the imposter cops down into the basement of this building where they were bound and gagged with duct tape. And then these two thieves proceeded to spend the next 81 minutes walking all around the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art before destroying the security footage and then fleeing the building. Rick and Randy were discovered unhurt later that morning by police, still tied up in the basement. Despite dozens of suspects, numerous viable theories, and a massive monetary reward, these two art thieves were never caught and remain at large today. As for the 13 pieces of stolen art, one of which includes the extremely rare Rembrandt painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is his only seascape in existence, they are still unaccounted for. And combined, they are worth a staggering $500 million. 2 p.m. on March 7th, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV upturned, partially submerged, and he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV, and so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here! Come over here, help!" But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, "Come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in." And so all these first responders are pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, "There's a baby in here! There's a baby in here!" And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped these straps holding the baby who had been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes at this point, he just took this baby, he turned away, he figured the first responders will handle this woman and he's going to take this baby to safety because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics. And right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing. But he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 25-year-old woman named Jennifer Grossbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know. But we know at 10:30, she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. Until finally, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, "Come save us, please." But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there, and when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard and they do not have an explanation for it. A police officer in Arizona was driving on the highway when he saw a tractor trailer that was pulled over on the side of the road with its hazards on. And so he pulls over, he gets out, walks out to the driver's side door, and he looks up at the driver and says, "Hey, do you need any help?" And the driver is still sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel. He's barely acknowledging the police officer. And he kind of looks down and shrugs and just says, "No, I'm okay." The police officer doesn't know what it was, but there was something off about this guy. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was something off about him. He couldn't tell what it was. So he asked him again, "Are you sure that nothing is wrong?" And the driver, again, very sketchy, just says, "No, nothing's wrong." And so the police officer, acting on a gut instinct, says, "Hey, can you step out? Do you mind if I talk to you outside of your vehicle?" And so very reluctantly, the driver kind of slithers his way out of the vehicle, making sure that he doesn't fully open the door to kind of let the officer see what's going on inside his cab. He gets out and shuts the door, and the two start talking. Over the course of their conversation, where basically the officer is trying to figure out what you're doing here. Why are you parked on the side of the road with your hazards on? Why aren't you telling me what's going on? Why are you acting so strange? At some point, the officer just kind of had enough and he said, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to need to search your vehicle." He opens up the door and goes inside, and there's nothing out of the ordinary in the front two seats. But when he looks into the back section where there was a sleeping compartment, because this is a big 18-wheeler, and there's like a little area in the back of the cab where these guys doing these long drives can sleep. When he looks into that section, he sees there's this woman with her mouth gagged, handcuffed, huddling in the corner of this sleeping section, looking absolutely terrified. The officer immediately gets out and he grabs the guy and he puts him under arrest. As he's arresting him, the driver is saying, "No, she wants to be here. She chose to be here." But the officer didn't buy it and he said, "You're under arrest for kidnapping." The officer puts this guy in his cruiser and shuts the door, and then he calls for backup. When backup arrived, they were able to take the woman out. She was unhurt. She survived. But it would turn out that she was one of the very, very lucky few, because the driver was Robert Rhodes, aka the truck stop killer, who over the previous 20 years had killed over 50 women. He was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But the crime that the truck stop killer was actually known for was not this kidnapping where this woman survived. It was the kidnapping and murder of a woman named Regina K. Walters. Regina was a young woman who came from a broken home, and at the age of 14, she ran away and began hitchhiking across Texas with her boyfriend. In February of 1990, Rhodes picked up Regina and her boyfriend, who were looking for a ride. Rhodes almost immediately kills Regina's boyfriend and takes Regina captive, and he keeps her chained up in his traveling torture chamber for several years before ultimately killing her as well. After Rhodes was finally arrested by this Arizona police officer on the side of the highway, the investigation searched Rhodes' house, and they found some pictures. This is a picture of Regina K. Walters in the abandoned barn where her body was ultimately found. Immediately after Rhodes took this picture, he ended Regina's life. A father and his young son were out for a walk in their small suburban town just outside of Barcelona, Spain. When they reached their downtown, they were going to turn around and walk back home, but the boy pleaded with his father to make a quick stop at the old theater. The reason the boy and many other kids in the town loved going to this old theater was because out front of it was this huge papier-mâché statue of a dinosaur, a stegosaurus to be exact. And so after a little bit of convincing, the father finally agrees and they start heading in that direction. After they turned the corner and could actually see the dinosaur statue, the boy took off running while the father just stayed back and walked leisurely, watching his son the whole time. And as he's watching his son, he can see he gets right up to the statue, and then the boy just kind of suddenly stops and stares at something on the bottom of the statue. And so the father notices his son has seen something peculiar enough to make him stop and stare, and so he yells to to his son, "Hey, what do you see?" And the son just points at the back right leg of the statue. And so the father thinks this is really weird, so he jogs up to his son and he crouches down right next to him and looks in the direction his son is pointing. And at first, the father believes all his son is pointing at is this fairly obvious crack on the outside of the statue on the back right leg. And he's thinking his son has just noticed that the statue is kind of falling apart. But as he's looking at this crack that his son is pointing at, he realized his son was not pointing at the crack. He was pointing at what was behind the crack, what was inside the dinosaur statue. And when the father realized what he was looking at, he grabbed his son, stood up, and ran in the other direction and called emergency services. A few minutes later, the police and fire department show up in front of this old theater. They get out and they go up to the statue and they confirm what's inside this back right leg. Afterwards, they go to their trucks and they get out chainsaws. Eventually, they were able to carve a big enough square on this back right leg that they were able to remove the thing that the father and the son had seen originally, and that was a dead man's body. Not much is known about this dead man, except that he was a 39-year-old man who his family had reported missing a couple of days before he was actually found. While we don't know this for sure, it's believed he decided to crawl inside the statue when he realized the belly of the dinosaur was movable. Now, it's not entirely clear how he figured that out. Either the belly was already moved and he saw the opening and so saw the opportunity to crawl inside for some reason, or he was poking and prodding at the statue and discovered the belly was movable, moved it aside, and then again seized the opportunity and crawled inside. But either way, the man crawled inside the statue, and then once he was in the dinosaur, his phone slipped out of his hand or slipped out of his pocket, and then instead of falling out of the dinosaur onto the ground, it fell inside the dinosaur and slid down the inside of the statue until it fell into the bottom of the bottom right-hand leg. And so the man decides to go after his phone, and so on his belly, he slides over to the back right leg, and then he begins lowering himself head first into the leg, reaching for his phone. And so as he's kind of slowly lowering himself down, using his legs to pin himself inside the statue, he gets closer and closer, and he's almost about to grab his phone when his feet lose their grip, and he slips and falls headfirst all the way to the bottom of this back right leg. The space he was in was so tight, he was not able to turn himself around and climb up and out again. In fact, it was so tight, he could barely move. His arms were pinned by his side, and so he couldn't use them to even push himself back up and out. And because he could not bend his legs, he could not use his legs to pull himself back out again either. And so this man most likely began screaming for help, but for whatever reason, nobody heard him. And so after what must have been several agonizing days, the man finally just died. His autopsy has not been made public, so we don't know for sure what actually killed him, although one could speculate he died of either dehydration or perhaps asphyxia from being trapped in this really tight space where his chest may not have been able to expand all the way, and so he would have eventually suffocated. Following the gruesome discovery, the dinosaur statue was removed from the front of the old who desperately wanted to find a husband and move out of her mother's home and start her own life. The man she would fall in love with was not a young, rich aristocrat like her family was hoping, but instead was an older, poor lawyer. Her mother told her that she needed to break off this relationship and find a more suitable suitor. But Blanche refused and said she was in love with this man. When her mother outright forbid her from seeing this man ever again, she refused and began sneaking out at night to spend time with this guy and was away from the home quite a bit, just kind of escaping her mom. But during this tumultuous time where Blanche is very much at odds with her mother, Blanche would unexpectedly die. And since this is the late 1800s, people did that at a young age. They just unexpectedly died. And so her lover and her family and society mourned her loss, but ultimately time went on and people moved on. 25 years later, in 1901, French police received this strange handwritten letter that just basically states that the Monnier family has a very dirty secret and you should go check their estate out. Now, the Monnier family was in excellent standing in Paris. I mean, they were one of the more prominent families. The mother, she was known for her charitable works. They were just one of those families that everybody knew, including certainly the French police. And so when they got this letter, they weren't actually that concerned that there was any truth to this letter, but they felt like it was their duty to at least go knock on the Monnier family's door, show them the letter, and then just take a look around. And so they did that. They showed up. They showed the Monnier family, including her mother, who was at the door, hey, we have this letter. Would you mind if we looked around? The Monnier family was very cooperative. They let them walk around their whole big estate. and the police didn't find anything. As they're chatting in the doorway, getting ready to leave because this is all just a big misunderstanding, one of the officers turns and looks up a little flight of stairs that they hadn't gone up and notices a small door that's been padlocked shut, and it's the only door at the end of this one stairwell. And he says off the cuff to the family, well, what's in that door up there? And Blanche's mother says, oh, that's a supply closet. You know, our assistants come in and they'll go in there and use that. And the French police officers say, well, would you mind if we just poked our heads in? It's the only space we haven't checked. And since we're already here, we'll just check that box. We'll go in there and poke our heads in. At this point, the Monnier family says, no, we're not going to let you go in there because you don't need to. It's just a supply closet. Now the police say, you're going to go ahead and open up that door. At which point the family says, no, we're not. So one of the officers tells the family to stay right here, while the other officer goes up the stairs to try to break open this lock and see what's in there. As soon as he's right outside the door, he's hit with this overwhelmingly disgusting smell. It smells like rotting flesh. It smells like death. He covers his mouth and he breaks open the lock and he opens the door, and there in the middle of this dark, disgusting smelling room on a rotting straw mattress is none other than Blanche Monnier. 25 years later, she is alive, she barely weighs 55 pounds, and she's chained to a bed. She has not come out of those chains or moved off of that bed in 25 years. The smell was so bad they could barely be in there for longer than a few minutes at a time. But one of the officers immediately goes over and knocks down some of the wood that was blocking up the windows, and sunlight pours into the room, and it's the first time Blanche Monnier is seeing sunlight in 25 years. The reason she had been imprisoned in this room is because 25 years earlier, when she was fighting with her mother about not seeing this poor commoner, and she wasn't willing to break off the relationship with him, her mother told her to go in this room and said, you can't come out until you tell me you're going to break it off with this guy. She was so in love with him that she said no, and her mother wouldn't let her leave. And then days turned into months, turned into years, turned into decades, and here we are 25 years later, and she had never left that room. The mother and the brother of Blanche Monnier were arrested, and the public found out about this, and it incited a huge mob that went to their house. And it actually caused Blanche Monnier's mother to have a heart attack, and she would end up dying only a couple of days later. And so she never had to serve any jail time or really answer to any of her crimes. And the brother was complicit in what was happening to Blanche Monnier, but he kind of weaseled his way out of it. As for Blanche Monnier, she was remarkably lucid when she came out of that room, and she commented on how lovely it was to breathe fresh air and to be in sunlight. She was brought to a hospital where she did make a recovery, but she was so screwed up from being in that room that she didn't really know how to function in society anymore. And so she was moved to a mental institution, and unfortunately she died about 10 years. 8-year-old Corey Kelly contacted his good friend Jim Naprud to see if he wanted to go grouse hunting with him. Grouse are a type of game bird. Jim agreed, and the pair decided to meet at the Red Lake State Wildlife Management Area in Foretown, Minnesota, which was not far from where either of them lived. So the two men, along with Jim's dog named Sammy, arrive at the campsite on October 16th. They get out, they start setting up the campsite, putting the tent up, getting all their food laid out, and that's when Jim realizes they did not bring gasoline. So he says to Corey he's going to go into town and get some gasoline. Corey said he would stay back and continue setting up the campsite, maybe go out and get some firewood, and he would look after Sammy while Jim was gone. When Jim pulled away from the campsite, he turned and saw Corey carrying a shotgun with Sammy by his side walking into the woods. And so Jim assumed he must be heading into the woods to go grouse hunting. An hour and a half later, when Jim came back to the campsite, Corey and Sammy were gone. Now at first, Jim wasn't concerned at all. He figured Corey was still out grouse hunting and that he and Sammy would be back any minute. And so Jim hops out of his truck and he continues setting up camp. He goes out and gets some firewood. The whole time he's kind of looking around the woods, waiting for Corey and Sammy to, make a sound or show themselves, and they don't. And as the sun goes down, Jim's starting to feel a little bit more worried. And so he gets his phone out and he tries calling Corey, but the cell phone reception's so bad, he can't place a call. Jim knew Corey was extremely competent in the outdoors. He was an avid hunter, and he knew this area really, really well. However, he thought it is possible he could have gotten turned around while he was out grouse hunting, and so I should signal where the campsite is. And so for several hours, Jim honked his horn and flashed his truck's lights in hopes that Corey would see or hear him. Finally, after midnight, when Corey and Sammy had not returned, Jim decided, you know what, I'm psyching myself out. I'm sure they're fine. They'll be back in the morning. I don't know what happened, but I trust Corey can handle himself. So Jim falls asleep, and very early the next morning when he gets up, he's looking around hoping he's going to see Corey and Sammy. They're still not there, and so Jim begins to search the area himself. Jim walks 2 miles into this forest that's very thick, it's very swampy. He sees no sign of Corey or Sammy, and he's yelling for them. He's trying to call Corey on his phone, but there's no reception. And so he turned around and walked back to the campsite, now trying to dial 911, but even that wasn't going through. It was a total dead zone. And then luckily he saw some campers that were out near his campsite, and he asked them to try calling 911, and their call did go through. The police show up and they begin searching this forest, and they find almost right away that it's so difficult to walk in this forest because of how swampy and marshy it is that they have ATVs brought in just so they can do a basic search of the forest. And for 2 straight weeks, they looked everywhere in this forest for Corey and Sammy, and there was nothing, no sign of them. Then on October 25th, 9 miles away from where Jim and Corey's campsite was, 2 hunters found Sammy wandering around the forest. And she was hungry and dehydrated, but overall she was in good health. And so they tried to get her to track to wherever Corey was, but she wasn't doing it. At this point, the focus of the search was shifted to where Sammy was found, and they began searching that area, and 3 days later, they found Corey's cigarettes and his lighter. The following day, they found Corey's overalls, socks, and sweatshirts, now 14 miles from where Jim and Corey's campsite was. But even after finding all these things that belonged to Corey in a relatively small area, they looked and they couldn't find Corey. And then the weather started to get really bad, and it started to snow in the area, and they had to postpone the search. The search was started up again in mid-November, and they brought out all these scent-sniffing dogs, and they searched that area near where all his things were found for 13 more days. But again, they couldn't find anything. And then another wave of bad weather came in, and they had to postpone the search again, this time for the whole winter. They began looking for Corey for a 3rd time the following year on April 28th by flying a plane over the area where all of his clothes had been found, and they were able to spot Corey's body. He was laying right in the middle of the swamp, right in the middle of the tall grass. It was determined he died of hypothermia on the first night he went missing, which means he had to have run a mind-boggling 14 miles through this forest before winding up in the swamp. And if you remember, on the very first search for him, the police were unable to just walk around the forest because of how swampy and wet it was. They had to bring in ATVs just to look around. And so the idea that Corey was able to run 14 miles in this swampy forest seemed impossible. In fact, that's what searchers said. It was impossible. Unless you were being pursued. If you think your life is in danger, you will do things that you cannot do unless your life is in danger. Adrenaline makes it that way. Lending credit to the idea he might have been pursued by someone or something is where he was found. He was found in the middle of this swamp, in the tall grass. There was a hard, packed path about 15 feet away from where he was found that he could have very easily gotten to. But he chose to be in the swamp, in the tall grass. So you gotta ask yourself, if you were in Corey's position and you had the choice between standing in knee-deep water in the middle of a swamp in the tall grass where there are other dangerous predators in the swamp, or you can just stand on a path and be safe, which would you choose? Well, obviously you choose the path under normal conditions, but if you were trying to hide from someone, you might choose the tall grass. The last time Jim saw Corey, he was walking into the woods with Sammy carrying his shotgun. But when they found Corey in the marsh, there was no gun. And in fact, that gun was never recovered. But they did find an expended shotgun shell casing basically along the path they think Corey took to get to the marsh. He did have his cell phone on him, but from what I read, it looked like either he didn't use it or he just never had any service. Corey's death was ruled an accident, even though many people believe it's far more likely he was being pursued by someone or something, because it's just not normal human behavior to, in the middle of the night, get up and run 14 miles through a swamp.